Chapter 1. The First Citizen. Welcome back. There is still no rush here, and still no test at the end. The fire is lit, the night is long, and Rome has kept exactly as promised. When we rested, a republic lay on a pyre in the Forum, and a frail boy of 18 was crossing the winter sea toward the most dangerous inheritance in the Roman world. Settle in again, and let us follow him. No one, this must be said first, because it is the key to everything, no one took the boy seriously. That was the great, repeated, fatal miscalculation of every rival he would ever have, and it began the moment he landed in Italy. Mark Antony, Caesar's brawling, brilliant lieutenant, who regarded the dead man's armies and honors as his own natural inheritance, met the pale young heir's claims with open contempt. The Senate's old survivors thought they had found a useful child. One of them famously proposed to praise the boy, promote him, and then dispose of him. And the boy, who now called himself Caesar, and never anything else, let all of them believe exactly what they wished, for exactly as long as it was useful. We will not march through the 14 years it took him to own the world. This series keeps its distance from Civil War's choreography, and these were years of maneuver as much as battle. Alliances made, broken, and remade between the boy and Antony. Armies bid for like properties at auction, with the dead dictator's veterans selling their eagles to the highest and most Caesarian bidder. But two things from those years cannot be passed at a distance, and the first is a debt this series owes under its own standing rules. Because when the boy and Antony finally joined forces, with a third partner history remembers mostly for being the third, they sealed their compact in the manner Sulla had taught the age, and Rome saw the whitened boards again. The second prescriptions were, by the ancient accounts, colder than the first. 3 men at a table, trading the names of each other's friends and their own kinsmen. An uncle bartered here, a brother there, until the lists ran to hundreds of senators and thousands of the wealthy, hunted through Italy that winter for the bounties on their heads, while their estates paid for the coming war. The historians preserved alongside the horrors stories of astonishing loyalty, slaves who died impersonating their masters, wives who smuggled husbands to the coast, as if the age were determined to keep some account of decency in its ledger. And one death stood above all the others, then and forever after. The oldest and most famous voice in Rome, the consul who had faced down conspiracies in the Forum, the orator whose speeches Roman schoolboys would recite for as long as there were Roman schoolboys, the last man who had genuinely believed the Republic's words could still outfight its swords, was on Antony's list for the crime of having said so magnificently once too often. His name was Cicero. He was overtaken fleeing to the sea, an old man in a litter, and he put his head out to the killers, the accounts record, with a steadiness his enemies never matched. And by Antony's order, his head and his right hand, the head that had spoken, the hand that had written, were carried to Rome and nailed up on the speaker's platform in the Forum. The Forum's voice, which we have followed since it was a murmur in a drained marsh. This is where its republic ends, on its own rostra, silenced, displayed by the men who had won. Let that image stand for everything the coming peace was built on, and let us go on. The liberators, Caesar's assassins, who had raised the East against the Avengers, were run down within the year and broken in 2 great battles in northern Greece, the survivors falling on their own swords in the old Roman manner. And the victors, with no one left to fight, divided the world between them. Antony took the rich and glittering East. The young Caesar took Italy and the hard West. Took, that is, the veterans, the recruiting grounds, and the city of Rome itself, which Antony, who loved appetite and warmth, was well pleased to leave to a cold young man with a talent for administration. It was, most observers judged, the better half of the bargain that went east. Most observers were wrong, for in the east, Antony's path crossed, permanently, that of one of the most remarkable monarchs of the age. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, last of the Greek dynasty that had ruled the Nile since Alexander. The same Queen Caesar had established on her throne, now a sovereign in full command of her wealthy, ancient, unplundered kingdom, and of several languages, a formidable intellect, and the last great treasury in the Mediterranean world. What began as alliance and liaison became, over a decade, a partnership of state. Her fleets and gold behind his armies, their children granted eastern realms, the pair enthroned side by side in ceremonies that Rome heard about in ever more lurid retellings. Whether Antony had gone native, gone grand, or simply gone where the money was, hardly mattered by the end, because the young Caesar in Rome, who understood, as few Romans before him had, the uses of story, made of it the perfect weapon. He fought the decisive war of his life without once declaring war on Antony. He declared it, the Senate obliging, on her, on the foreign queen who had bewitched a Roman, on the East against the West, on decadence against the old ways. And Romans who could not have stomached one more civil war marched willingly to a national one. The propaganda was unjust, to her above all. The real woman, a working monarch of considerable gifts, vanished for 2,000 years beneath the enchantress his poets built. This series will not repeat the trick, and she has her fuller portrait elsewhere. But the propaganda worked. The end came at sea, off a promontory of western Greece called Actium, 13 years after the Ides. A cramped, strange, strangely quiet battle, decided less by fighting than by nerve. By the traditional account, the Queen's squadron broke for open water with the treasury aboard, and Antony followed her. Whether as panic, plan, or a last desperate calculation, the effect was the same. The world followed neither. Within the year, the victors stood in Egypt. Antony, defeated and deserted, ended his own life in the Roman manner, and was carried, dying, to Cleopatra's refuge to die in her arms. Even his enemies' historians gave him that. The queen, taken alive and facing display in a Roman triumph, cheated the procession with a quiet, carefully arranged death. By the famous account, the bite of an asp smuggled to her past the guards. The truth of the method was uncertain even then, but the mastery of the exit was entirely her own. She was 39. With her ended the last independent monarchy of ancient Egypt, the final pharaonic throne, 3,000 years in the making, and the whole vast story this series once told on its own, folded now, as a private estate of the conqueror, into Rome. The young Caesar, standing before the tomb of Alexander, was 33, and there was no one left on earth to fight. Now pay attention, because what happens next is one of the most consequential pieces of political theater in Rome's history, and it is easy to be too cynical about it, and easy to be not cynical enough. Everyone knew what Sulla had done with absolute power, and everyone knew what Julius Caesar's frankness about it had earned him. Daggers at the foot of a statue. The victor of Actium had spent his whole young life studying exactly those two case histories. So, 3 years after Egypt, in a carefully rehearsed session of the Senate, he did the unthinkable. He gave it all back. Laid down his extraordinary powers, restored the provinces and armies to the Senate and people of Rome, declared the Republic, the word was used, restored, and asked leave to retire, his work of avenging his father done. The Senate, well prepared, refused with cries of protest, and begged him, in the name of the state's safety, to accept a package of perfectly traditional, perfectly legal offices and provinces. The governorship, notably, of precisely those frontier provinces where nearly all the legions happened to be stationed. He allowed himself, with becoming reluctance, to be persuaded. In the days that followed, an obliging Senate added honors, chief among them a new name, resonant of religion rather than royalty, a word tinged, in Roman ears, with the sacred and the auspicious, with the augury of founders. Augustus. And in the years that followed, quietly, one lapsed grant at a time. The remaining pieces settled into place. The lifelong power of a tribune, sacred, untouchable, the people's protector. That office born in the plebeian walkouts 4 centuries before, now worn permanently by the master of the world. Precedence in the Senate, oversight of grain, roads, morals. He held, at almost every moment, some venerable Republican office or bundle of them. He simply held them all, together, forever. He never took a crown. He never sat a throne. He dressed simply, lived, by the standards of the fortunes around him, modestly, in a house on the Palatine Hill rather than a palace, walked to the Senate, endured lawsuits, stood for election to offices no one dared contest. The word he preferred for himself was princeps, first citizen, merely, you understand, the first among equals. And from that word, history names the whole system he built, the Principate. The Republic's every form survived. Consuls elected yearly, Senate convening, assemblies voting, the forum's voice speaking daily. And beneath the forms, one fact, which every senator, every soldier, and every child in the street understood perfectly, and no one said aloud. All the eagles belonged to one man. The armies were his, sworn to him, paid by him, pensioned by him. The frontier provinces were his. The treasury of Egypt was his personal property. Rome had solved the problem of the last century of the Republic, the problem of the warlords, in the only way, perhaps, it could still be solved. By having, permanently, exactly one warlord, wearing the Republic as a garment. Was it a fraud? The great historian of the next century thought so, bitterly. The same securities of law, he wrote in essence, the names of everything preserved, and the substance of everything gone. But hold the other side of the ledger honestly, as this series must. The civil wars stopped. After 100 years of Roman blood in Roman streets, the Gracchi, the lists, the marches on the city, a full generation in which no one had lived a life untouched by political killing. They simply stopped, and stayed stopped, in the central lands of the empire, for more than 2 centuries. The doors that Rome bolted on the night of the Ides could be unbolted. Grain came in. The roads were safe. A man could invest in a farm, or a marriage, or a child, with some confidence the world would still be standing in 20 years. The Romans had a word for what Augustus gave them, and they did not use it cynically. They stamped it on his coins and built it an altar. Pax. Peace. Whether peace at that price was worth it is a question the Romans themselves never stopped asking quietly. It is our series' own question wearing new clothes. And this series will keep both columns of the ledger open to the end. He ruled in all for over 40 years, long enough that by the end, almost no one living could really remember the Republic as a working thing rather than a story. And he did not rule alone. Beside him, through all of it, for a marriage of more than half a century, was his wife, Livia, a formidable aristocrat of the oldest blood, whom he had married in a rush of scandal in his ruthless 20s, she pregnant by, and hastily divorced from, her previous husband, and who became, over the decades, something Rome had never had, a partner in the Principate. He consulted her, the sources agree, on matters of state as a matter of course, and kept her counsel among his papers. She managed her own vast properties, corresponded with cities and kings, modeled, deliberately, publicly, the grave, wool-working, old Roman matron the regime's morality campaigns demanded, and she understood the system her husband was building, at least as well as he did. Later writers, unable to abide a powerful woman without a poison bottle, would insinuate her hand into nearly every convenient death in the dynasty. The insinuations are just that, and this series reports them as gossip with a grudge. What is certain is that when Augustus finally died, an old man in his bed, his last recorded words in private were addressed to her. "Livia, remember our marriage, and farewell." And that Rome, which had begun by whispering about the scandal, ended by granting her, in time, the honors of a goddess. Her fuller story, like the Queen of Egypt's, is told elsewhere, but no honest account of the founding of the empire leaves her out of the founding. What Augustus made, meanwhile, with his 40 years and the world's money, can still partly be touched. And here we come to the city itself, and to a boast the historians put in his own mouth, that he had found Rome a city of brick, and left her a city of marble. For once the boast undersells. The Rome of the Republic's end was, we have seen, a magnificent slum, vast beyond precedent, and looking it in the worst sense. Augustus rebuilt it as a capital, temples by the dozen restored. The count in his own public accounting ran past 80. The forum repaved and ringed with gleaming new halls of law and record. A whole second forum of his own construction, its temple to Mars the Avenger discharging the vow of a 19-year-old at Philippi. Theaters, porticos, warehouses, the first great public baths. Aqueducts repaired and doubled under the tireless administration of his oldest friend, until the fountains of the city ran day and night, free, public, and unprecedented. A fire brigade, a police force, a grain administration, the humdrum machinery, never glamorous, that keeps 1 million people alive, invented largely in these decades. The white Italian marble of the new buildings came down new roads from new quarries. And let it be said once, in this bright chapter, in the plain manner we have promised. The hands that cut, hauled, and set that shining stone, like the hands that cooked in the great houses and kept the ledgers and raised the children of the regime's families, were in vast numbers enslaved hands. The labor of the conquests, Gauls and Egypts and all the rest, built into the visible splendor of the peace. The marble city was the trophy of the same system it decorated. Both truths, as ever in this story, stand together. And over the marble city, in these same years, something new settled. Something we have been tracking since an augur first framed the sky in chapter 2, and which now takes the turn that will carry it to the end of our story. The peace, Augustus understood, needed to be more than administered. It needed to be believed. He took up, and wore for the rest of his life, the office of chief priest of the Roman state. The lapsing rites were revived, the priesthoods refilled, the temples rebuilt. The message everywhere the same. The Pax Deorum, the old peace with the gods, so plainly shattered through a century of civil blood, was restored, and the restorer was Augustus. And around the restorer himself, veneration began to gather in a new way. His adoptive father, the murdered Caesar, had been formally declared a god of the Roman state. A comet had blazed over his funeral games, and the crowds, in Roman belief, had taken it for his soul ascending, which made Augustus, in official style, the son of a god. In the eastern provinces, where kings had been worshipped for centuries, cities begged leave to raise temples to him outright. In Rome itself, where such things were not done, subtler forms arose. In Roman belief, every man had a genius, a guardian spirit of his line, and it became pious, then customary, then in certain settings legally expected, to pour a libation to the genius of Augustus, at public banquets, at the crossroad shrines of every neighborhood, beside the household gods at 10,000 hearths. Was the first citizen a man or something more? Officially, while he lived, a man, merely the most blessed of men, standing nearest the gods. In belief, in practice, in the drift of decades, the line was blurring, and the blurring was policy. Rome, which had expelled its kings for being too high, was learning to look at one family the way it looked at heaven. Watch this. It grows for 3 centuries, and then it meets a rival that will change the empire's soul. Let us end the chapter as the outline of this whole series promised we would. At dawn, on the Palatine Hill, in the last years of the long reign. We may picture it in early summer, first light coming up beyond the Alban Hills, the old volcano's ring, unchanged since the shepherds, and the city emerging below in layers of gray and then gold, and then astonishing white. The new marble catching fire building by building, the temples on the Capitol across the way, gilded roof tiles beginning to burn, the Forum below still in shadow, its pavements empty and shining faintly with the night's washing, smoke rising already, straight in the windless morning, from the altar fires. Somewhere among them, the altar of peace itself, its carved processions of the imperial family, senators, children, priests, frozen mid-step in marble on its walls. The first cries of the water sellers, the creak of the night's last delivery carts heading out of the gates they must clear by sunrise. The smell of bread, 100,000 loaves baking, riding over the smell of wood smoke and the river. And on the hill itself, in the fenced quiet of the imperial compound, between the modest house and the temple of Apollo, one may imagine the old man himself at his early business as his secretaries assemble. Thin now, wrapped against the morning cool he always felt, going through the world's correspondence at the hour he had kept for 50 years, in the house where he kept, it was said, no luxury but time. Below him, the largest city in the world, at peace. Around it, invisible from any hill, the thing he never named and entirely possessed. He had outlived every rival, every partner, every plan for his own succession, outlived nearly everyone except the empire and Livia. And there, in that last clause, waits the flaw in all the marble. The one problem the great architect of permanence never solved, because within the fiction he had built it could not even be stated. The Republic's offices could not be inherited. The first citizen was, officially, merely a citizen. And so the one question on which the peace of the world now hung, after him, who? Had no legal existence at all. It could only be managed, sideways, through the old private law of the Roman household. Adoption, marriage, the grooming of heirs within one family. The Principate, that public mask, would pass like a farm or a name, through the bloodline, with all the accidents, griefs, and monsters a bloodline can produce. Augustus died in his bed, past 45 summers after Actium. The historians record a deathbed jest, that he asked his friends whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and if so, to send him off with applause, and whether or not he truly said it, Rome understood why the story fit. The Senate declared him a god of the Roman state, as it had his father. The mask he had made was lifted onto the next face. What the mask did to the faces beneath it, that is the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Court and the City. From here, for the next several reigns, this story is really two stories, running at the same time in the same city, and the art of this chapter is to keep both in view, because most tellings of Rome keep only one, and it is the wrong one. The first story happens on the Palatine Hill, where Augustus's modest house is swelling, reign by reign, into the sprawling residence that will give every subsequent language its word for such places. Palace from Palatine. It is the story everyone knows a version of. The dynasty of Augustus's blood and Livia's, 4 emperors across half a century. A family saga that the Roman historians themselves wrote up with such dark relish that it has been sold as scandal in every century since. Poison at dinner, informers at the door, marriages made and unmade for succession's arithmetic, an old emperor brooding on an island, a young one burning bright and wrong. The second story happens everywhere else, in the streets below the hill, and in the million lives that filled them, and its plot is almost scandalously different. The grain ships came in, the fountains ran, the court sat, the contracts held, the tenements filled and emptied and filled, and the largest city in the world got on with its enormous daily business, decade after decade, caring, much less than the palace ever imagined. Who exactly wore the mask this year? Hold both stories. The palace story tells you what absolute power does to a family. The street story tells you what the Augustan machine had actually achieved. An empire that could now run for years at a stretch, almost regardless of who sat at the top of it. Even when what sat at the top of it was frightened or frightening or both. The palace story first, then, told at this series' pace, which means we will not audit every scandal. The ancient historians who preserved them, let it be said now and remembered throughout, were senators writing under later dynasties, men with every literary and political reason to paint the dead family dark, and while we will not launder their portraits, we hold them as portraits, brilliant, hostile, and unverifiable. Augustus's heir, the survivor of the succession's long grief, stepson of the first marriage, Livia's son, was Tiberius, a man in his 50s when the mask reached him, Rome's most experienced general, able, severe, and by every account, profoundly unsuited to the performance the principate required. Augustus had played the beloved first citizen with a diplomat's warmth for 40 years. Tiberius could not and would not play it. He scorned the Senate's flattery while resenting its independence, took offense easily and forgave slowly, and governed, this the record shows beneath all the hostile color, with grim competence. Frontiers held, provinces decently run, the treasury full. But the reign curdled all the same, poisoned by the thing Augustus had left unsolved. With supreme power now heritable in one family, every member of that family was automatically a threat to every other, and around each gathered factions, and around the factions, informers. Treason trials, that innovation of fear, began to consume the aristocracy, name by name. And Tiberius, aging and disgusted with Rome and the role alike, finally did what no ruler of the world had done. He left. Withdrew for the last decade of his life to a villa on the island of Capri in the Bay of Naples, ruling the empire by correspondence from a clifftop, while Rome, deprived of the mask's face but not its power, learned how much malice could be done in an absent emperor's name, and the historians filled the vacuum on the island with rumors we will leave, as they should be left, to the historians. Of Caligula, the reign that followed, we will keep the custom of this series and let the young emperor pass as the tradition's own cautionary tale. 4 years, a bright beginning, then extravagance, cruelty, and mockery of every republican fiction at once, ended by his own guard swords in a palace corridor. The dynasty's first plain demonstration that the mask could be transferred by murder. And of Claudius, the reign after that. The stammering, scholarly, middle-aged uncle whom those same guards, finding him hiding behind a curtain, hailed as emperor more or less because he was the family member nearest to hand. We will keep chiefly what mattered most, that the accident turned out startlingly capable, adding a new province in Britain and much sound administration, and that his court completed quietly a transformation the Republic would have found more shocking than any scandal, the rise at the empire's operating center of the emperor's own freedmen, former slaves of the imperial household, Greeks mostly, running correspondence, treasury, and petitions as private secretaries to the master of the world, and richer and more powerful, some of them, than any senator. The Republic's magistracies had become ornaments. The real state now lived in a household, and a household, as we learned long ago in Chapter 3, is a little kingdom, staffed by the unfree. It is in this palace world, and this is why we have moved through it briskly, that the figure at the center of the dynasty's last act rose, and her story, even reduced to its load-bearing bones, tells more about the Principate's design flaw than all the scandals together. Agrippina, called the Younger for her mother, was Augustus's great-granddaughter, and had survived a childhood that would have broken most people. Her famous father dead young, and Rome universally believed poisoned. Her mother and brothers destroyed one by one in the treason trial darkness of Tiberius's reign. She herself the sister of one emperor, exiled by him, and recalled to become, by a marriage requiring a special act of the Senate, for he was her own uncle, the wife of the next. She came to that marriage with a son from an earlier match, and one unwavering project. The mask would come to that son. Within 5 years, she had achieved what no woman of the dynasty, not even Livia, had held. The title Augusta while her husband lived, her face on the imperial coinage beside his, her presence, unprecedented, scandalous to the old-fashioned, enthroned beside the emperor at state occasions, and her son adopted as the aging emperor's heir, ahead of the emperor's own blood son. When the old emperor then died, after a dish of mushrooms, said all Rome, seasoned by his wife. The historians assert it. The truth is beyond recovery, and this series files it where it files Livia's poisons, as the age's reflexive way of crediting any woman's success. Her son was presented to the guards and the Senate within hours, 16 years old, polished, charming, and entirely hers. His name was Nero. For the first years, the arrangement was, by the strange standards of the story so far, a success. The young emperor reciting speeches written by his tutors, the Senate flattered, the empire competently run by the grown-ups, and behind all of it, Agrippina, at the summit of any Roman woman's power in the state's whole history to that point. Receiving embassies, her face on the gold coinage facing her sons, equal to equal. It could not last, and the historians tell the unraveling as tragedy's oldest plot. The son grew into the power she had given him, chafed at the giver, pushed her step by step from the palace, the coinage, the guards' protection. And finally, the accounts here grow lurid, and we hold them at arm's length while keeping their agreed core, resolved that she should die. The famous story has a first attempt worthy of the theater Nero loved. A boat engineered to collapse at sea, which duly collapsed, and the emperor's mother, who had swum since childhood, swimming quietly ashore in the dark. What followed was not theater. Sailors were sent to her villa to finish it plainly, and the historians record of her end only a single, terrible gesture of defiance, which we pass on at the distance we keep for such things, that she bade the killers strike first at the body that had borne him. Rome was told it had been a conspiracy discovered. Rome, the sources make clear, believed not a word of it, and something in the reign's foundations, the pretense, however thin, that the first citizen was bound by anything at all, went out of it with her. She had built the throne her son sat on and become the first thing it consumed entirely. Her fuller portrait, too, belongs to the companion telling. Here let the plain shape stand, because the dynasty's whole flaw is in it. A system with no lawful way to share or transfer power will be worked by other means. Marriage, adoption, poison, guardsmen, and will then punish most savagely whoever works those means best. Nero, freed of his mother and then of his tutors, ruled another 9 years, and we can render their essence briefly. A ruler of genuine gifts, aesthetic ones, who wanted with all his heart to be not first citizen but first artist, singer, lyre player, charioteer, impresario, who competed on public stages while senators watched with fixed smiles and made the horrified aristocracy's attendance at his performances a loyalty test, who emptied the treasury on spectacle and architecture, and under whom the treason trials returned until suicide by command became almost a routine of upper-class life. The age's most famous philosopher, his own old tutor, opening his veins at dinner on his former pupil's order, discoursing calmly to his friends as he went, in a death scene Rome never forgot. The palace story, by this point, has become exactly the cautionary tale the old republicans would have predicted. And yet, hold the second story steady. Through nearly all of it, the empire ran. The frontiers held or advanced. Even Britain, newly taken and then nearly lost in a great rising of the conquered, was dragged back inside the Roman order. A great fire in Rome, we are coming to it, was followed by intelligent replanning. The grain came in. The machine Augustus built was proving the darkest of its virtues. It did not much need the man at the top to be good. Now set the palace aside, as promised, and come down the hill, because it is time this series kept faith with the other million people in this chapter, and there is no better door into their world than an ordinary evening. We may picture a single tenement stairwell in one of the packed valleys between the hills, on a warm autumn evening midway through the dynasty. At street level, the building is business. A cookshop on the corner, all charcoal glow and shouting, selling hot chickpeas and wine to people whose rooms upstairs have no kitchens. Most of Rome eats out, not as luxury but as necessity. Beside it, a coppersmith shuttering his shop, a barber sweeping, the fountain at the corner, Augustus's aqueducts still running, surrounded by the evening crowd of water jars and gossip. One floor up, behind real windows, the building's aristocracy. A merchant's family at a proper dinner, a hired flute drifting down. Climb, and the staircase narrows, the plaster roughens, the rents fall, and the families grow. 2 rooms here for a stonemason, his wife who takes in spinning, 3 children and his widowed mother. Higher still, single rooms. A porter, a seamstress, 4 students sharing. Until under the tiles, in the cheapest garrets, the city's newest arrivals sleep to the sound of pigeons an arm's length overhead. No water above the ground floor. It is carried up, jar by jar, and everything else is carried down. Light is a bought luxury. Most of the building goes to bed with the dark. And then, as the lamps go out, the other Rome begins. The law still bars carts from the streets by day, so night is when the city is fed, and the darkness fills, hour after hour, with the sound the poets complained no Roman ever slept through. Iron-rimmed wheels on stone, drovers' curses, the whole thunder of a million peoples tomorrow being hauled past the door. The stonemason's family sleeps through it, as you learn to. Above the noise, over the tiled roofscape, the sky holds the last green of evening. On its hill, one window of the palace is still lit, and neither knows, or much wonders, what the other is doing tonight. That is the city. It was always most of the story. It was that city, the tenements, the cookshops, the carried water, the timber and the crowding, that met, in the 10th summer of Nero's reign, the disaster it had always been built for. The fire began in the shops at one end of the great chariot stadium, on a hot night with a wind, and by morning it was beyond anyone's stopping. It burned in all for upward of a week, died down, and broke out a second time. And when it was finally beaten, the accounting, by the ancient reckonings, ran. Of the city's 14 districts, 3 erased outright, 7 more gutted, only 4 untouched. The dead uncounted then and unknowable now. Hundreds of thousands homeless in the fields and monuments outside the walls, and gone with the tenements. The historians grieved, irreplaceable things, temples of the king's era, spoils of the old wars, the accumulated memory of 7 centuries. It was the worst single calamity the city had suffered since the raiders from the north, half a millennium before, and it is owed its plain paragraph here, as every such event is in this series. A vast, real human catastrophe, mourned in its own time, of which the famous legend, the emperor fiddling on his tower while Rome burned, is exactly that. A legend, growing tale by tale within a generation. The soberest ancient account has Nero away at the coast when it began, hurrying back, opening his own gardens to the homeless, and driving down the grain price. And also notes, in the same breath, the rumor Rome could not be talked out of, that the fire had been set, or helped, for the emperor's convenience. For when the ashes cooled, Nero rebuilt, much of it wisely, wider streets, height limits, mandated firewalls and water access, less timber and more of that quietly revolutionary Roman concrete. But he also carved out of the burnt heart of the city, for himself, a country estate, park, lake, and a palace sheathed in gold and gems, the Golden House, with a bronze colossus of himself at the gate 100 feet high. 1 million people had lost the city, and the visible profit of it was his pleasure garden. Whatever the truth of the arson, Rome had decided whom to blame. And Nero, the sources tell us, needed someone else for Rome to blame instead, and reached for a small, obscure, unpopular group at the city's margins, and thereby wrote them, for the first time, into Roman history's record. They were followers of Jesus of Nazareth, a Judean teacher executed under Tiberius in the province of Judea by a Roman governor, a sect Rome barely distinguished yet from the Jewish communities among whom it had begun, known to their neighbors mostly for keeping apart, refusing the gods, the games, and the emperor's genius alike, whispered about, as closed groups always are, in the ugliest terms. In Christian belief, and we will frame that belief, here and everywhere in this series, exactly as we have framed the Roman kind. The executed teacher had risen from death, and his followers awaited his return and a kingdom not of this world, which made them, to Roman eyes, at best unfathomable, and at worst disloyal to every bond, civic, religious, imperial, that in Roman belief held the Pax Deorum and the state together. On these people, Nero fixed the arson. What followed is recorded by the most unsparing of the Roman historians, no friend to the sect, which he calls a deadly superstition, and precisely for that reason a witness worth hearing. And we will keep to his account and to our rules. Numbers of them were seized and convicted, he writes, less on the fire's evidence than for their supposed hatred of humankind, and were put to death in Nero's own gardens with a theatrical cruelty we will name an outcome and not linger on. Deaths staged as spectacle, by beast and by cross and by fire, the emperor mingling with the crowd in costume. And then the historian adds the sentence that has echoed ever since, that the spectacle backfired, that even a hostile public, watching, began to feel pity, sensing that these people were being destroyed not for the city's good, but for one man's. It is the first appearance of the Christians in Roman history, and very nearly the first in our story. A persecuted handful in a tyrant's garden. Mark the moment well. The series will need it. 3 centuries from tonight, the mask of the Caesars itself will belong to that sect. After the fire, the reign had 4 years left, and they tell in a sentence what the dynasty had become. A conspiracy of senators failed and fed a terror. The emperor toured Greece, winning rigged festival prizes while the provinces seethed. And when at last the armies of Gaul and Spain renounced him, the eagles, remember, decide. And the guards in Rome were bought, and the Senate found its courage and declared him a public enemy. Nero, abandoned in a suburban villa with a handful of freedmen, made his exit in character. Delaying, rehearsing, mourning aloud, the historians give him the deathless line, "What an artist dies in me," until, at the sound of approaching horsemen, a freedman helped him drive the blade home. He was 31. With him ended the line of Augustus and Livia, the first dynasty of the Roman peace, extinct in its 4th generation. Proof, written in its own blood, of everything the founders' unsolvable problem had promised. And within weeks, the empire discovered something worse than a bad emperor. The fascinating, terrifying fact that the mask now lay on the ground, and every army on every frontier could see it. What happened next? The year Rome learned its ugliest secret, that emperors could be made elsewhere than Rome, belongs to our 4th chapter. But we will not go there directly. Because to understand both how the empire survived that year and everything else it survived for 2 centuries more, you need to see the thing the palace stories never show, the machine itself. The roads, the legions, the letters, the water, the sheer, patient, world-spanning hum of the thing. The empire at work. Chapter 3. The Roads and the Eagles. Now we do something this series has been promising since a muddy track first crossed a ford, 7 centuries of story ago. We are going to stop the parade of rulers entirely. No dynasty in this chapter, and almost no names, and look instead at the thing itself, the machine that hummed on beneath the palace melodramas, the apparatus of roads and legions and water and law that made 50 million lives across 3 continents into a single working world. This is the quietest chapter in the series, and nothing much happens in it, which is precisely the point. What we are listening to for the next while is the sound of the Roman peace actually running. Begin with the scale, stated plainly, because the numbers are the landscape. The empire of these generations, the long 2nd century of the peace, reached from the moors of northern Britain to the cataracts of the Nile, from the Atlantic shore to the rivers of Mesopotamia. 5,000 miles across, containing somewhere between 50 and 60 million human beings, by most reckonings, something like a fifth of everyone alive on Earth. And here is the first surprise, the one that unlocks all the others. The army that held this together numbered, all told, legions and auxiliaries, fleets and guards, perhaps 400,000 men. One soldier, roughly, for every 150 inhabitants, and nearly all of them stationed not among those inhabitants, but far away at the edges, strung along the rivers and frontier roads, facing outward. The interior of the Roman world, Gaul, Spain, Africa, Asia Minor, whole provinces the size of modern nations, went generation after generation with scarcely a soldier in sight. Rome did not hold the world down. The world, for the most part, held itself inside a framework Rome provided. And this chapter is about that framework. Start where Rome always started, with the legions and with the eagle above them, because this is the chapter where that motif we planted on an augur's hilltop comes to full wingspan. A legion was roughly 5,000 men, Roman citizens, volunteers now, signed on for 25 years, a working lifetime, for steady pay, a savings account held at the standards, and at the end, a discharge bounty or a plot of land. The state, having learned at last the lesson of Marius's poor, had made itself the only patron a soldier needed. Beside every legion served roughly equal numbers of auxiliaries, provincials, not yet citizens, Batavian horsemen from the Rhine mouth, Syrian archers, Balearic slingers, Britons and Thracians and Moors, serving under Roman officers, in Roman order, for one reward above all: citizenship at discharge, for themselves and their children forever. Understand what that meant, multiplied by centuries. The open door we have tracked since the Sabine legend, now a standing imperial institution, turning the empire's edges into Romans at the rate of thousands of families a year. The conquered, quite literally, soldiering their way into the conqueror's name. What did these men actually do? Far less fighting than the word legion suggests. In a typical year on a settled frontier, a soldier fought no one. He built. The legions were the empire's engineering corps. They cut the roads, raised the bridges, dug the canals and harbors, quarried, surveyed, made brick and tile stamped with their legion's number. Archaeologists sort the empire's ruins by those stamps to this day. A historian who watched the legions at their training left the one-line summary the world has never improved on. Their drills, he wrote in essence, were bloodless battles, and their battles bloody drills. Discipline was the whole religion of the institution, and religion is the accurate word. Every legion's standards were kept in a shrine at the heart of the camp, beside the images of the emperors. They were anointed and garlanded on festival days. Oaths were sworn by them, and above them all stood the eagle itself, silver or gold now, wings back on its pole. One per legion, borne by a chosen veteran, guarded like a sanctuary treasure. Because in the soldier's belief, the legion's honor, its luck, and something like its soul lived in that bird. To lose an eagle was a disgrace beyond military defeat. Early in the peace, 3 legions were ambushed and destroyed in a German forest, and the state spent years of campaigning, and counted it worth the cost, largely to hunt the 3 lost eagles home. The augury that never lands, we called it once. Here is its full meaning. The Romans had taken the bird that once carried heaven's approval and made it the vessel of the state's own sanctity, and pinned that sanctity, this chapter must add quietly, to whichever man the soldiers followed. Hold that. It is the machine's one flaw, and we will end the chapter on it. Now, the roads. And let this be the payoff of the oldest promise in this series. The muddy track by the ford became the queen of roads. The queen of roads became a network, and the network, by the height of the peace, ran to something on the order of 50,000 miles of engineered, paved, all-weather highway, with several times that again in secondary gravel roads, binding 3 continents into one traversable thing. The engineering had not changed since Appius Claudius, only multiplied. The surveyed line, arrow straight across country wherever the land allowed, because the road's first customer was a marching column. The excavated bed, the layered foundations, the cambered surface shedding rain into flanking ditches, the fitted paving stones, rutted now by centuries of wheels, and every mile, the Roman mile, 1,000 double paces, a stone pillar taller than a man, declaring the distance and the emperor who had last repaired the way. In the Forum in Rome stood a gilded column from which, in principle, all those distances were measured, every milestone in the world, counting toward one point. The saying that all roads lead to Rome was, for once, very nearly the administrative truth. And along the roads ran the empire's nervous system, the state relay post, way stations every 10 miles or so with fresh horses, inns a day's ride apart, by which official dispatches moved at 50 miles a day, routinely, in any month of the year, and in emergencies far faster. The record bursts, carried by relays of riders through day and night, approached 200. A government in Rome could ask a question of a governor on the Euphrates and hold his answer in about a month. Nothing in the Western world would reliably move information faster across such distances until the railway and the telegraph. 17 centuries after Rome fell, let us take one such journey ourselves, slowly, the way this chapter is allowed to. We may imagine a single letter, written in Rome on an autumn morning by a supply contractor, addressed to a junior officer at a fort on the empire's far northwestern edge, in Britain. It leaves the city before dawn in a courier's satchel, out the northern gate onto the Great Trunk Road, and runs its first day through the traffic of Italy. Marble wagons, mule trains, a senator's coach, pilgrims, peddlers, a legion's recruiting party. The courier threading past them all at the trot, changing horses at noon and mid-afternoon, sleeping the first night at a posting inn in the Apennine foothills, where the stable smells of 40 horses and the common room argues about chariot teams. Days 2 and 3. Down onto the Po Plain, fog on the rice-flat fields, then the long turn west, the Alps standing up slowly ahead like a white wall with a secret gate. The pass, days 4 and 5, is all switchbacks and drovers' bells. The road narrowing but never failing, snow already dusting the heights above. A temple of the mountain god at the summit where carters toss a coin. Then down, hairpin by hairpin, into Gaul. A week of Gaul, the road running string straight through wine country and oak forest, through towns each with its little forum and its bathhouse smoke, the milestones ticking past. The courier does not read them anymore, but the letter is crossing, at 50 miles a day, a country that took Caesar 8 years. Day 12 or 13. The Channel port, salt in the air, the letter's first sea, a night crossing on a supply ship, lanterns swinging, and then Britain. Colder, greener, the road still Roman and still straight, running north through a smaller, rawer version of everything. Days of it, until the land empties, the farms thin out, and on an afternoon of driving cloud shadow, 3 weeks or so from Rome, the courier raises the fort. Turf and timber and stone on its ridge, smoke flattening in the wind, the eagle-less standard of an auxiliary cohort snapping above the gate. The letter has arrived at the end of the world, on schedule, and the world's edge signs for it. And here this series gets to keep one of its favorite promises, the promise that the old world is still physically present, because we do not have to imagine what such letters said. At exactly such a fort on that northern frontier, archaeologists in our own lifetimes have dug from the waterlogged ground hundreds of the letters themselves. Thin leaves of wood, written in ink, preserved by the airless mud for 19 centuries. And they say, this is the glory of them, almost nothing historic. A soldier is sent socks, sandals, and underwear from home. A clerk grumbles about the beer supply. Someone calls the local Britons by a slang nickname. And one, written for the commandant's wife, invites her friend, sister, she calls her my dearest soul, to a birthday party on the 3rd day before the Ides of September. Warm regards. Hopes she can come. It is among the earliest surviving Latin ever written by a woman's hand, and it is a party invitation. 50 million lives, remember, and nearly all of them were this: birthdays, socks, beer, and the post arriving. That is what the roads were for. The legions were how the empire fought, once in a while. The roads were how it lived, every single day. What the roads did on land, the sea did tenfold for bulk. The Mediterranean in these centuries was, for the only sustained era in its history before or since, a lake with a single owner. No pirates, no rival navies, one law in every port. And across it moved the traffic that kept the system alive, above all the grain. The great freighters out of Alexandria and Carthage. Rebuilt Carthage, Roman Carthage, thriving on the site of the curse. Running the summer sea lanes to the engineered harbors at the Tiber's mouth, where the river of our first chapter, at the end of all its history, had become the throat through which the largest city in the world was fed. Hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat a year, barged upstream to the warehouses, milled, baked, and, for a broad slice of the citizen population, handed out by the state itself, the daily bread of the peace. Cut the sea lanes for one season, every emperor knew, and Rome starves in the next. File that away for the far end of our story. Add the water. 9, then 11 great aqueducts served the capital alone by the height of the peace, mostly buried channels, contrary to the postcard image, surfacing onto those famous arched bridges only where a valley forced them, delivering, by gravity alone, over gentle gradients maintained across 50 miles of country. Water in quantities per person that many modern cities would envy. For the fountains at every crossroads, where the tenement dwellers filled their jars. For the naval battle spectacles. For the endlessly running public baths, where, for a small coin, the porter and the senator sweated in the same marble halls. The one place in Rome, moralists joked, where the classes actually mixed. Provincial cities built their own, hundreds of them. Some still carry water today. And it was all maintained, this must be said in the plain manner we have promised, by a permanent staff that included hundreds of state-owned slaves, organized in gangs under the waterboard, enslaved men whose entire lives were the empire's plumbing. The same is true down every corridor of the machine we have walked this chapter. Enslaved clerks kept the archives. Enslaved porters worked the docks the grain crossed. Enslaved miners, still, always, the mines. Cut the silver the soldiers were paid in. The machine's hum, wherever you lean close to it, has this note inside it. We said in part 1 that we would not let it go, and we do not. Now step back and see what all of it, roads, sea, water, law, added up to, because the sum is stranger and more interesting than conquest. Across the whole vast interior, the empire was quietly converging on a shared way of being a town. From the Atlantic to the desert's edge, hundreds upon hundreds of cities, most of them founded or refounded under the peace, were building themselves the same civic kit: a forum with a basilica for law, a bathhouse, a theater or amphitheater, temples to the same gods under locally translated names, a council of local grandees competing, at their own crushing expense, to give their town one more portico, because that was now what greatness meant. A man could travel from Britain to Syria, merchants, students, and pilgrims did, and find in every town the recognizable grammar of the same civilization, the same coins in his purse, the same law in the basilica, Latin in the west and Greek in the east, and both understood in the middle, the same baths at evening. Rome, by the height of the peace, was less a place than a format, and citizenship in it, spreading now by service, by manumission, by grant to whole towns and provinces, was on its way to the day, coming within a century, when almost every free person in the empire would simply be Roman. And binding it all, deeper than the pavement, ran the oldest export of the forum, the law. One legal order, courts, contracts, wills, property, procedure, running in every province. A merchant's agreement sealed in Britain increasingly intelligible and often enforceable, under procedures a lawyer in Syria would recognize. The accumulated case wisdom of centuries, tended by professional jurists, growing into what stands among the most sophisticated bodies of law the ancient world produced. We planted a claim back in Chapter 3 of Part 1 that the idea of law as public property would prove to be among Rome's greatest exports, and here is its adult form, working. And here, too, let us plant something for the very end of our journey, and say it plainly once. This fabric of state, law, and Roman identity, already 5 centuries old in the era we are describing, was to prove one of the longest continuities of state, law, and imperial identity the world has ever known. When this series reaches its final chapters, we will stand at the far end of that continuity, more than 1,000 years from tonight's chapter, and measure the whole astonishing length of it. Remember that this is where we planted the measuring stick, here at the peace's high noon, when no one imagined an end at all. One more scene, and then the flaw. Come back to the frontier, and let us put the machine to bed for the night. We may picture a legionary fort on the northern rivers at dusk in early autumn, the rampart walk lit rose gold, the river below running dark under its timber bridge, the far bank, the other world, already in shadow. The day's work parties are filing in from the road cut and the timber lot. The horns sound the first watch. At the headquarters building, the day's watchword goes out on its tablet, and in the shrine at the fort's heart, the standards stand in lamplight. The gilded eagle among them under its guard, the flame kept before it like any temple's. While next door, in the strong room beneath, the soldiers' savings sleep in iron-bound chests. The legion's soul and the legion's pay, wall to wall, which is the whole institution in one small building. Cook fires now down every barrack row. The smell of bread and bean stew, a whetstone somewhere, dice, a letter being read aloud, socks perhaps, or a birthday. Laughter, the surgeon's window lit late. On the wall, the first watch sentries pace their measured intervals, cloaked against the river cold, watching the dark country across the water where wolf light moves at the tree line, and along the whole enormous frontier, down this river to the next fort's watchfire just visible, and the next, and on around the arc of rivers and desert and mountain and sea, 10,000 miles back to this same spot. The same horns are sounding the same watch. The same eagles stand in the same lamplight, and the same word, tonight's word, is passing from post to post around the ring of the world. Inside the ring, 50 million people are going to sleep unarmed. That, not any battle, was the eagle's actual work, and on most nights of most years of 2 long centuries, they did it. But you have already seen the flaw, because we planted it with the eagle itself. All of this, the roads, the law, the bread, the peace, obeyed the standards, and the standards, as a terrible year had already proven, and this series has already whispered, obey the man the soldiers choose. The machine had no loyalty to Rome that did not pass through loyalty to a person. And when the person failed, when a dynasty died childless and despised, as Nero's did, the machine did not stop. It did something far more dangerous. Every army on every frontier looked at the empty center, then at its own general, and did the arithmetic Sulla had taught the world. 4 times in a single year, the arithmetic came out. That year, and the dynasty of builders it produced, and the terrible things and the astonishing things they built, is where we go next. Chapter 4. The Flavians and the Arena. The year after Nero's death, Rome discovered what the peace was made of, and the discovery cost a civil war. Within a single circuit of the seasons, 4 men wore the mask of Augustus, an aged aristocrat raised by the armies of Spain, murdered in the Forum by the guards he had declined to bribe, a court favorite raised by those same guards, dead by his own hand when the Rhine legions came south against him. The Rhine legion's own blunt general, feasting through a summer rain while the armies of the Danube and the East declared for a 4th, and then the 4th. Rome itself was fought through that winter. The capital, the holiest hill of the state, burned in the fighting, a thing that shook Romans more than any casualty list. And when it was over, the ugly secret the historians said that year let out could never be put back. Emperors could be made elsewhere than Rome. The armies knew their strength now. For 2 centuries, the knowledge would mostly sleep. It never again went away. The 4th man, the one who kept the mask, was nobody's idea of a Caesar, which was precisely his qualification. Vespasian was a tax farmer's son from the Sabine hill country. The small farm, no-name Italy this series began among, a career soldier of proven worth and no dangerous glamour, nearly 60, who had commanded the war then burning in Judea and had once, the story went, fallen asleep at one of Nero's recitals and lived. He came to a treasury emptied by Nero and a capital scarred by fire and civil war, and his answer was a reign of almost aggressive ordinariness. Taxes restored and invented. When his son wrinkled his nose at a new levy on the urine collected by the fullers' shops, the emperor, the historians tell us, held a coin from it to the young man's nose and observed that money does not smell. The account books balanced, the capital rebuilt, the emperor himself carrying out the first basket of rubble. The doors of the palace open at dawn to petitioners, the emperor cracking jokes at his own expense in an accent the senators found rustic. Rome, after a century of the Julio-Claudian theater, found itself governed by a man who worked. Even his dying, a decade on, kept the register, rising to his feet for the end because, he said, an emperor ought to die standing, and getting off on the way, the most double-edged joke in the whole story of the imperial cult, one that tells you Romans themselves could hear the strangeness in their own belief. Dear me, the historians report him sighing, "I think I am becoming a god." He was, of course. The Senate deified him in due form. The joke and the apotheosis are both true, and both Roman and this series offers them together, as Rome did. But the Flavian peace was founded, as Rome's foundings so often were, on a conquest. And this one the series owes its full, unflinching paragraph, because it stands among the heaviest single events in our whole story. The war in Judea had begun in Nero's last years, a province long mishandled. Decades of corrupt governors, religious insult, and tax squeeze upon a people whose fierce, ancient monotheism made them, alone in the empire, unable to fold their God among Rome's, rising at last in open revolt, expelling its garrison, defeating the first Roman counterstroke. Vespasian had ground the country back under control. When the civil war called him to the throne, the finish fell to his elder son, and the finish was the siege of Jerusalem. For 5 months, through spring and summer, the legions ringed a city swollen with refugees and pilgrims and torn within its own walls by warring factions who burned each other's granaries while Rome built its ramps outside. And what happened inside, we know from a witness, the historian Josephus, a Judean commander captured early in the war, who spent the siege in the Roman camp, calling on his countrymen to surrender, and spent the rest of his life recording, in grief and self-justification, what he had watched instead. He describes the famine in detail we will not reproduce, enough to say that he records the starving, tortured for hidden food, the escapers crucified in sight of the walls by the hundreds until, he writes, wood ran short, and the dead beyond all counting or burial. When the walls came down in late summer, the city was taken street by street in fire and massacre. The temple itself, the center of Jewish worship on earth, the single sanctuary of the one God, standing on foundations laid 1,000 years before, burned with it against, Josephus insists, the Roman commander's own orders. Believe that or not, the temple was gone, and it has never risen again. Josephus's totals, over 1 million dead in the siege, near 100,000 enslaved, are ancient figures, surely swollen. The catastrophe beneath them is not. The survivors went to the mines, the markets, and the arenas of the empire. The temple's treasures, the great 7-branched lampstand among them, were paraded through Rome in triumph, and you may see them still, carved in procession on the triumphal arch that stands at the edge of the Forum to this day. The empire's own stone photograph of a people's darkest hour. For the Jewish people, this was the wound around which much of the next 19 centuries of their history, scattered, longing, enduring, and arguing with loss, would form. This series marks it plainly as what it was, one of the gravest acts in Rome's long ledger, and one whose consequences outlived Rome itself. And in Rome, the plunder of that war built the building. For a decade, the heart of the capital had been Nero's private paradise, the Golden House and its parkland, a landlord's fantasy pinned across the ruins of the burned districts. Vespasian's masterstroke was to give it back. The palace grounds broken up, the great ornamental lake drained, and in its bed, funded, an inscription tells us plainly, from the spoils of the Judean war, and raised by tens of thousands of hands. Among them, very likely, captives of that same war. There went up across 10 years the largest amphitheater the Roman world would ever build. A freestanding oval of arcaded stone, the height of a modern 15-story building, seating 50,000, engineered with such cunning, 80 numbered entrances, tiered circulation, awnings rigged by sailors against the sun, that a full crowd could be seated or emptied in minutes. Rome called it plainly the Flavian amphitheater, after the dynasty that built it. Much later ages, after the colossal statue that stood beside it, would call it the Colosseum. Its inaugural games ran, the record says, 100 days. It stands yet, perhaps the most instantly recognized ruin on earth, the postcard of Rome itself, and everything about it is double. A tyrant's pleasure ground returned to the people, as a place for the people to watch people die. So we have arrived at the arena, and this series will keep here the particular discipline it promised at the outset. More restraint for this, not less, precisely because this violence was designed to entertain, and it retains that power over an audience even 19 centuries on. We will understand it. We will not stage it. Understand, first, that in Roman belief the games were not, at their root, frivolous. Gladiatorial combat had entered Rome centuries before as funeral rite. Armed men fighting at a great man's burial, a blood offering to honor the dead, and something of the sacred clung to it always. The arena's dead were carried out through a gate named for the goddess of funerals, by attendants costumed as the gods of the underworld. Onto that route, the emperors grafted politics. The games were where ruler and ruled met face to face, 50,000 citizens and the emperor in one bowl, the crowd chanting petitions, cheering or booing with a frankness permitted nowhere else, the emperor's responses to the mob read like weather signs across the empire. The arena was, in the cold phrase of one modern summary the Romans would have recognized, the parliament of the Principate. A poet of the age sneered that the people who had once commanded armies and elections now longed anxiously for two things only: bread and circuses. The sneer stuck for 2,000 years, but note that it was a Roman's own bitter joke about the bargain, not a neutral description. The bread was real, the games were real, and what had been traded for them, the poet meant you to remember, was the Republic. Who was on the sand? Overwhelmingly, the unfree and the condemned. Prisoners of war, Jerusalem's survivors among them in these very years. Enslaved men sold to the gladiatorial schools. Criminals sentenced to the arena in its various grades, from fighting with a chance, down to none. A minority, it must be recorded, because it perplexed the Romans too, were free volunteers, driven by debt or hunger for fame, who swore the gladiator's oath to be burned, bound, beaten, and slain by the sword, a formula that tells you exactly what was being signed away. Around the fighters stood an industry. The schools with their barracks, drill masters, diets, and physicians. A trained gladiator was a heavy investment, and most bouts, the evidence suggests, were not to the death for precisely that reason. With the era's fatality odds for a skilled fighter closer to a dangerous sports than a massacre's. The fame, which was enormous, champions' names in graffiti on the walls of Pompeii, their portraits on lamps and cups, their sweat scraped and bottled, sold as a love charm, and the infamy, which was total. The adored fighter was legally without honor, in the same civic category as the pimp and the executioner, adored and untouchable at once. Women fought too, occasionally, to the fascination and scandal of the crowd, until a later emperor banned it. And beneath the fighters, in the arena's strict daily order, came the ones for whom no odds existed. The midday interval between the morning's beast hunts and the afternoon's matched bouts was given to the public execution of the condemned, unarmed, undefended, killed by beasts or fire or blade as sentence and spectacle at once. Of these deaths, this series will say only what they were, and one thing more, that they were watched, at lunchtime, as routine. One philosopher of Nero's court, the same one we later watched open his veins, wrote home revolted after wandering into the midday show expecting light entertainment. This, he told his correspondent in essence, was pure murder, and the crowd's holiday mood the most instructive horror of all. His was a minority report. That is the fact about the arena that a calm history must not soften. Not that Romans failed to see what it was, but that, seeing, the overwhelming majority for 5 centuries came back, brought their children, and saved for good seats. And the animals, this too belongs in the honest ledger. The morning hunts consumed wildlife on an industrial scale. Lions, leopards, bears, bulls, elephants, ostriches, crocodiles, shipped in a specialized empire-wide trade to die in the sand by the dozens and, at the great inaugurations, by the thousands. The 100 days that opened the Colosseum alone were said to have used up 9,000 beasts. Over the centuries, the drain emptied whole regions. The elephant from North Africa, the lion from the Near East's edges, the hippopotamus from the Lower Nile, and extinguishing the Romans themselves occasionally remarked on, without ever once, so far as our records show, considering that it might be reason to stop. Hold all of it together, because the building demands it, the engineering genius and the sacred root, the emperor and his 50,000, the trained professional with his fan mail, the war captive with none, the midday condemned with nothing at all, the crowd that was neither uniquely cruel nor remotely troubled, ordinary people, the same ones we have loved in the tenement stairwells, at a show. The Colosseum is Rome with nothing left out. The organizational brilliance, the open-handed public splendor, the law's majesty and the law's victims, all in one bowl of travertine, and no honest telling of this civilization gets to keep the aqueducts and hand back the arena. Both, as we have said before in this series, and will say again, are the same Rome. The dynasty's second reign was brief and is remembered almost entirely for its disasters. A great fire in Rome again, a plague, and for the gentleness with which the new young emperor met them, spending like a man, Romans said, who knew he had no time. He had barely 2 years. But one of his disasters this series has been saving, because it is at once the era's darkest local catastrophe and, by the strangest mercy in archaeology, the brightest window we possess into every ordinary life this series has tried to honor. In the first summer of that short reign, in the year we count as 79 after the birth of Christ, roughly 19.5 centuries ago, and the one date this chapter will fix, the mountain above the Bay of Naples, a green and famous wine slope that no one living knew had ever been anything else, tore open. We know that morning hour by hour because a witness wrote it down. The admiral of the fleet across the bay, the elder Pliny, a scholar official whose encyclopedia of the natural world survives to this day, saw the cloud rise, noted with a naturalist's eye its shape, like one of the region's flat-crowned umbrella pines on a trunk of miles-high smoke, and sailed toward the disaster, first for science, and then, as the shore filled with the trapped, for rescue. He died on that shore, in the ashfall and the fumes, an old man who would not leave while others waited for boats. It is his teenage nephew, the younger Pliny, reading his books, he admits, on the safe side of the bay, whose 2 letters to a historian friend, written years later, give us everything. The cloud, the panicked crowds with pillows tied to their heads against the falling stone, the sea drawn strangely back, the darkness at midday. Not a moonless night's darkness, he writes in substance, but a sealed room's, his mother begging him to leave her and save his young legs, and his refusal, and the 2 of them sitting down at last, in the black rain of ash at the roadside, shaking it off in shifts so as not to be buried standing. They lived. Below the mountain, the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum and thousands of their people did not. And the same fall of ash that killed them kept them. Pompeii was not burned or swept away. It was sealed. Streets, houses, bread, dice, scribbles on walls, under yards of volcanic fall and forgotten for 17 centuries, so that its excavation, still unfinished in our own time, amounts to the opening of a letter the 1st century addressed to no one. This series has spent 4 chapters now insisting that the palace was never most of the story. Pompeii is the proof, delivered by catastrophe, and we will close this chapter there, gently in the town itself, on the last ordinary morning, which we may reconstruct with unusual confidence precisely because everything stopped mid-gesture. We may picture it then, a market town of perhaps 12,000 on a summer morning like 300 summers of mornings before it. In the bakeries, the day's loaves are in the ovens. In one of them, 81 round loaves, scored in eighths, which are in a museum tonight, carbonized and whole. At the corner cook shops, the jars are set into the counters, and the first customers lean and gossip. The fuller's crew treads laundry in its vats. A school class chants in a portico. The walls, as every year, are shouting the town's elections in red paint. Vote for this man for Edile. The fruit sellers back him, honest baths and good bread. Beside gladiators' tallies, lovers' boasts, a line of Virgil misquoted, someone's complaint that they were overcharged. In the grander houses, the fountains run in the atriums. In the doorway of one, set in mosaic, a black dog strains on its chain above the words, "Beware of the dog," which visitors read tonight exactly where they were laid. Down at the harbor gate, the fish sauce is loading. Someone is repainting a shutter. A child's game board is scratched into a paving stone and abandoned mid-game. None of it knows it is an ending. That is the entire poignancy of the place. It is not a city preparing for death, but a Tuesday. And when the mountain speaks just after midday, all of it, the loaves and the ledgers and the chained dog and the votes never to be cast, passes in a few hours out of time and into the ash, addressed, though no one knew it, to us. Hold Pompeii, and let it do for this chapter what it does for all history. It converts the empire's millions from a number into neighbors, and carry one more thing forward. The dynasty of the builders ended, after the short, gentle reign, with 15 years of the founder's younger son, able, suspicious, hated by the Senate he terrorized, and murdered at last in a palace plot with the connivance of his own household. The pattern, in other words, resuming on schedule. But this time the ending was different, and the difference opens the brightest chapter of the whole story. There was no dynasty left, and the armies, for once, held still. And the Senate, given its first free choice of an emperor in the state's history, chose, with what mixture of wisdom and exhaustion we cannot now untangle, a mild, elderly, childless senator. Childless. Hold the word. Out of that accident, the empire was about to stumble into the one succession system that ever really worked for it, and into the long golden afternoon that the next chapter is named for. Chapter 5. The Golden Afternoon. There is a sentence, famous among historians, written 17 centuries after the events of this chapter, by the man who told Rome's fall more grandly than anyone, that if a person were asked to name the period of history in which the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, point to this one, the near century we now enter, from the elderly senator's accession to the death of the philosopher emperor. We should hold that famous judgment the way this series holds everything, at a thoughtful distance. It was pronounced by a man looking at the sunlit side, and we will walk the shadowed side too, and the enslaved and the frontier peoples of this golden age were not consulted for the verdict. But we should also let the judgment breathe, because it is not empty. For 3 or 4 generations, an entire human lifetime, and then another, the largest state the Western world had known was governed, by and large, sanely, peacefully, and with something like conscience, under rulers who worked at it. After the century we have just crossed, and before the one that is coming, the listener has earned an afternoon in the sun. So has Rome. This chapter is that afternoon. The mechanism of the miracle, as we planted at the last chapter's close, was an accident wearing the costume of wisdom. The elderly senator reigned briefly and nervously. The guards bullied him. The state held its breath. And he solved his weakness with the oldest tool in the Roman household: adoption. He adopted, as son and heir, not a relative but the best available man, the empire's most respected general, in command on the German frontier, and died months later, leaving the world, for once, to exactly the person the world would have chosen. And because that man, too, had no son, and adopted in his turn the best of the next generation, and he likewise, a pattern emerged and held for nearly a century. Each emperor selecting, training, and formally adopting his successor from among the ablest men of the state. Merit, dressed in the old Roman clothes of fatherhood. Ancient and modern admirers alike have praised the adoptive system as political genius, and it partly was. But this series keeps its accounts honest, and the honest ledger reads, "It worked because, for 80 years, no emperor happened to have a living son." The one who finally did, we will reach him at this chapter's end, followed nature instead of the pattern, and the afternoon ended. The Golden Age, in other words, ran on wisdom and luck in roughly equal parts, which is perhaps the most Roman thing about it. The Pax Deorum, a philosopher might have said, is also just the weather, and the weather held. 3 names will carry the afternoon for us, the cap of this chapter, with the first and gentlest of the adopted, and the quiet quarter-century of the 4th reign, allowed to dissolve as our custom is. The first is Trajan, and begin with where he was from, because it is the quiet headline: Spain. A provincial, born in a colonial town near modern Seville, of a family Italian in origin but provincial for generations, now wore the mask of Augustus. The open door this series has tracked since the Sabine Hills had reached, at last, all the way to the top, and the empire barely blinked. It would never really close again. After the Spaniards would come emperors from Gaul, from Africa, from Syria, from the Balkans, the empire learning, ahead of almost any state in history, to be governed by its edges. Trajan himself was the army's man and the Senate's darling at once. A broad-shouldered, plain-living soldier who walked the city on foot, drank with his officers, and ran the state with such tact that the Senate voted him the title best of princes and meant it. For centuries after, new emperors were greeted with the prayer that they be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. His reign's great outward work was conquest, the last great expansion of the story. 2 hard wars across the Danube against the rich mountain kingdom of Dacia, roughly modern Romania, told here in our way. Outcome, not choreography. The kingdom destroyed, its extraordinary gold reserves taken, the largest single windfall since Egypt, funding a building boom and 100 days of games we will not linger in after last chapter. Its land planted so thickly with colonists that the country's very name today, Romania, is the conquest still speaking. And in Rome, wound in a spiral ribbon up a marble column that stands complete tonight in the middle of the city, his ashes once rested in its base. The whole campaign is carved like a film in stone. The legions bridging the Danube, building, marching, fighting. The Dacians resisting, burning their capital, their king choosing death over parade. Read honestly, as this series must, the column is both a masterpiece and a conquest's own self-portrait, and the grief on the carved Dacian faces was put there by Roman sculptors who saw it and thought it worth recording. Under Trajan, briefly, at the empire's greatest extent, from Scotland's edge to the Persian Gulf, after a last old man's war toward Babylon that his successor would quietly hand back. The map was as large as it would ever be. The successor is the second name, Hadrian, and with him this chapter turns from expansion to something rarer in the history of empires, the deliberate choice of enough. Hadrian gave up Trajan's easternmost conquests within months, judged the empire complete, and then did what no ruler of it had done. He went to see it. More than half his 21-year reign was spent on the roads and sea lanes of the last chapter, years-long circuits through Gaul, Britain, Spain, Africa, Greece, Asia, Egypt, inspecting legions and drilling them personally, auditing cities, correcting governors, climbing Etna to see the sunrise, scratching graffiti poetry, leaving behind him everywhere buildings, benefactions, and exasperated local officials. The empire's supreme power, for 2 decades, was most often a dust cloud on a provincial highway. The road, our old motif, never carried anything stranger or more telling than this. An emperor whose reign was, in effect, one long patrol of the ring, and the ring is what he built. On the moors of northern Britain, his wall ran sea to sea, 70-some miles of stone and turf and mile castles, less a dam against invasion than a statement in masonry. Here, exactly here, Rome has decided to end, and you may walk beside long stretches of it tonight. In Rome, he rebuilt the Pantheon, the temple of all the gods, crowning it with a dome of poured concrete 142 feet across, lit by a single open eye of sky at its crown. A building so far beyond its age that it remains, 19 centuries on, the largest unreinforced concrete dome standing on Earth, still in use, still lit by its eye, arguably the most perfect Roman thing that exists. Yet his reign carries, too, one of the gravest entries in this part of the ledger, and it will not be passed over. In Judea, a generation after the temple's fall, his policies, a pagan city planted on Jerusalem's ruins among them, helped ignite a second great revolt. Years of ferocious war ending in devastation, the sources describe in appalling round numbers. the survivors enslaved or scattered, Jews barred from their own city on pain of death, and even the province's name erased from the map in favor of one recalling Israel's ancient enemies. The golden afternoon, this series repeats, had shadows the postcard leaves out. This was among the darkest. Between the second name and the third, the quiet reign. A quarter-century under Hadrian's chosen successor, a mild and frugal Italian gentleman under whom, quite simply, almost nothing happened. No wars of note, no crises, the machine of Chapter 3 humming at its smoothest. A stretch so serene that historians, dependent on catastrophe for material, have complained for centuries that they can find nothing to say about the happiest years their subject ever knew. Let the complaint stand as the rain's monument, and let the rain teach the series' quietest lesson, that the best years leave the thinnest files. The third name is Marcus Aurelius, and he is where the afternoon light goes long and low. Chosen as a boy by Hadrian's foresight, raised and trained for the office across 20 years, he came to the throne the most conscientiously prepared ruler in the story, a man soaked since youth in Stoic philosophy, that austere Greek discipline of duty, self-command, and calm before fate. And fate, with what looks like deliberate irony, handed the philosopher the hardest reign of the century. The Eastern Frontier War came first, and the armies that won it carried home, in their baggage and their bodies, the calamity that marks this golden chapter's true turning, the Great Pestilence. It spread down the roads of Chapter 3, the machine's excellence for the first time working in death's favor, through the crowded cities, the legionary camps, Rome itself. It returned in waves for a generation, and the modern estimates of its toll run from several million lives toward 10 or more, out of 60. This series gives the plague its plain paragraph, as it gives every mass calamity. Whole towns and garrisons hollowed out, the army recruiting hard and short, the land short of hands, the treasury short of everything, and in the streets, the historians record, the old religious dread rising, processions, sacrifices, scapegoats sought. For in Roman belief, a blow of this size could only mean the Pax Deorum itself was broken, that heaven's peace had been somehow forfeited. Remember that reflex. In the next chapter, it starts looking for someone to blame, and in part 3, it changes the world. And with the plague came the wars, not of expansion now, but of pressure. Peoples of the north, set moving by forces beyond the frontier's sight, crossing the upper rivers in strengths not seen before, at one terrible moment raiding into Italy itself, the first such intrusion in nearly 3 centuries. Marcus, the indoor philosopher, spent most of his last decade in armor on the Danube, wintering in frontier camps, grinding the invasions back river mile by river mile. And it is there, at night, in a war camp in the fog country, that he wrote the thing he is loved for, a private notebook, never meant for publication, of a man talking himself into getting up each morning, reminders that anger serves nothing, that the present moment is all anyone possesses or loses, that the soul is dyed the color of its thoughts, that a man's task is simply to be good in the place fate has stood him, as an emperor or otherwise, that all of it, victories, empires, the writer himself, will be forgotten soon enough, and that this, rightly seen, is not despair, but freedom. The world calls the notebook the Meditations. It has never since been out of readers' hands, and the picture it leaves, the master of the known world, by lamplight, between plague reports and casualty lists, coaching himself in humility, is the Golden Age's best self-portrait and its epitaph at once. The honest ledger adds, in the plain voice we keep for it, the philosopher's serenity rested, like everything else in this chapter, on the unfree. The camp that housed the notebook was staffed by the enslaved, as was every villa and office of the sunlit age, and the meditations, which question nearly everything, never quite question that. The blind spot at the golden afternoon's very best is the measure of how deep the institution ran. Now, before the shadows lengthen further, this chapter keeps the outline's promise and leaves the emperors altogether, because the truest claim of the Golden Age was never the quality of its rulers, but the ordinary world they presided over, and we have not yet walked it at its noon. Come south, across the sea the empire made safe, to the province the empire made rich. Africa, Rome's Africa, the olive-green coastal world of modern Tunisia and Algeria. By this era, one of the most prosperous and urbanized corners of the entire empire, feeding Rome its grain and much of its oil, studded with hundreds of self-confident little cities whose amber-stone ruins stand in the sun today. And let us spend a market day in one of them. We may picture a town of 10,000, inland, on the high wheat plateau, on a market morning in the reign of Marcus, dawn coming up over country, striped to the horizon with olive rows and stubble fields. The road into town, straight, of course, and older than anyone's grandmother, already loud with the country coming in. Donkeys under sacks of the new wheat, olive farm carts, a shepherd boy driving lambs, a landowner's daughter riding while her enslaved groom walks. The town gate, then the grid of paved streets, and the morning unfolding in the same civic grammar we learned in Chapter 3, translated into African stone. The little forum filling with awnings and stalls, wheat, oil, figs, pottery, a bookseller with second-hand philosophy, a letter writer at his table, the basilica behind it already busy, a land dispute in one aisle in Latin, a dowry contract in another in Greek or in Latin touched by Punic speech. Because this town speaks 3 languages and prays, on its various days, to Saturn who was Baal, to Calestus who was Tanit, and to the deified emperors, all within 2 streets. Steam is rising from the baths by mid-morning. The schoolmaster's class chants its grammar under the portico. Some of those boys' grandsons will be Roman senators. One of this province's sons will one day wear the purple itself, and in a century or two this dusty, brilliant province will give the world its greatest Christian mind. None of that is visible yet, and no one is looking. At noon, the forum smells of grilled sausage and crushed olives. The money changer's scales click. The town's one celebrity, a retired charioteer, holds court by the fountain. A slave dealer, too, has his platform by the gate. This series does not crop him out of the sunlight. And in the cool of the late afternoon, the farmers roll home along the straight road with salt and cloth and gossip. The swifts come out over the amber town. The bath smoke drifts, and the mosaic floors in the good houses. Leopards, vine leaves, the 4 seasons, laid by local workshops whose work now fills the museums of the world, catch the last light exactly as they were designed to. Nothing happened in this town today. Nothing had for 80 years. Multiply this day by thousands of towns and 3 generations, and you have weighed the golden afternoon truly. Not the emperors, not the column, but an unbroken human ordinariness of a breadth and duration the ancient world had never managed before. Resting, the ledger says one last time, on the unfree and the frontier legions, and now beginning, at the edges, to feel the wind change. for the afternoon ends the way afternoons do, imperceptibly, then obviously. Marcus died in the war camps of the Danube, worn out at 58, the frontier war unfinished, and the adoptive miracle died with him, in the simplest way possible. He had what his 4 predecessors had lacked: a son. He had raised the boy to succeed him, hoping training could do for blood what selection had done for merit. And the historians make the son's reign the very hinge on which their story turns from a kingdom of gold, one of them wrote, to one of iron and rust. 19 years old, uninterested in the Danube or in government, hurrying home to the pleasures of the capital, and descending across a dozen years into a strange arena-obsessed tyranny. The emperor himself, to Rome's fascinated horror, performing in the Colosseum, that ended, as such reigns now ended, with his own household strangling him in his bath on the last night of the year. What followed the murder was the lesson of Chapter 3's flaw, taught this time without mercy. The guards auctioned the empire, literally, the historians insist, from the ramparts to the highest of 2 bidders. The province's armies rose in disgust, and the eagles fought each other for 4 years until the hardest of the generals, a grim, gifted African, took the mask, founded a soldier's dynasty, and spoke the age's epitaph in his deathbed advice to his sons. The historians give him the words: "Be good to each other, enrich the soldiers, and despise everyone else." The sons were not good to each other. The soldiers were enriched until the coinage itself began to thin. And the world of the market town, the grammar class, the mosaic floors, the 80 quiet years, stood at the edge of the longest emergency in Roman history, which is the next chapter, and the last of this golden part. Chapter 6. The Long Emergency. Every long story has a chapter that its own tellers could barely keep straight, and for Rome it is this one. The 50 years, give or take, that historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a half-century storm of civil war, invasion, plague, bankruptcy, and breakup in which the empire of the Golden Afternoon very nearly died, did not quite, and came out the far side, transformed into something its grandparents would scarcely have recognized. The ancient sources for these decades are thin, late, and confused. The emperors come and go too fast for even Roman historians to keep count. And that, for once, is a convenience, because this series was never going to march you through them anyway. We will do here, deliberately, what we have done all along with minor kings and lesser consuls, but now at scale. Let the rulers blur into weather, and keep our eyes on the empire itself, on what the storm felt like from inside, and how, astonishingly, the thing survived. First, the shape of the storm, plainly. The soldier dynasty of the grim African lasted some 4 decades and ended in a murder, and with it ended the last pretense that the mask of Augustus passed by anything but the army's favor. There followed, across roughly 50 years, a procession of soldier emperors. The count, depending on how one reckons it, runs past 20 legitimate claimants, and past 60 if every general hailed by his troops for a season is included, nearly all of them raised by their legions, nearly all of them killed by their legions or by arrivals, their average reign shorter than a consulship of the old republic. A man could be born, in these years, under one emperor and come of age under his 10th. The forum's voice marked the motif in its lowest hour, still met, still passed its decrees, still deified the dead and acclaimed their killers. But the Senate now merely notarized what the frontier armies decided, its speeches addressed, in effect, to an empty chair. The eagles, which had guarded the ring for 2 centuries, spent 50 years fighting each other inside it. And while they fought, the ring failed. Because the deeper cause of the whole emergency was not Roman ambition, but pressure from outside, of a weight the old world had never carried. Along the northern rivers, the familiar frontier peoples had been consolidating into new and far larger confederations. The Goths above the Black Sea, new leagues along the Rhine, set moving, in part, by migrations far beyond Rome's sight. And in the east, something graver still. The tired old Parthian realm was overthrown from within and replaced by a new Persian empire, aggressive, centralized, sacred monarchic, remembering 1,000 years of Persian glory and wanting it back. For the first time since Hannibal, Rome faced a peer. The blows came, decade after decade, at both ends at once, and the 50 years ledger of them reads like the golden afternoon inverted. The Danube breached, and the Balkans raided to the sea's edge. Gothic fleets, words no earlier Roman could have parsed, burning the cities of the Aegean, the great temple of Diana at Ephesus among them, an emperor killed in battle against the Goths in a marsh, the first ever to fall to a foreign enemy, and blackest of all, an emperor of Rome, an old man leading the eastern armies, defeated, tricked, and taken alive by the Persian king. Dying years later a prisoner and trophy, the king's mounting block, said the stories that Romans told each other with loathing. The truth is beyond recovery, and the humiliation needed no embroidery. Cities that had not seen a sword in 10 generations, the market towns of our last chapter, now dug ditches and threw up hasty walls, quarrying their own theaters and tombstones for the stone. Archaeologists find the 3rd century all over the empire as exactly that layer. Statues and inscriptions of the Golden Age, broken up and packed into hurried fortifications. Add the invisible enemies. Plague returned at mid-century, a second great pestilence, a generation after the first, moving down the same roads, so lethal at its peak that one bishop's city was said to bury thousands in a day. And with the plague, the money died. Emperor after emperor, needing to pay ever more soldiers with an ever thinner treasury, quietly clipped the silver from the coinage, the denarius that had been mostly silver under Marcus dwindling within 2 generations, to a bronze washer with a silver rinse, until the oldest quiet promise of the Roman peace, that the coin in your hand was worth its face, dissolved. Prices lurched. Hoarders buried the old good coins. Their pots of them surface in plowed fields to this day. And in stretches of the countryside, people slid back to paying in kind, in grain and cloth and days of labor. And under the triple weight, sword, plague, and coin, the empire did the thing that terrified its rulers more than any of the 3. It began, at the edges, to come apart. For over a decade, a breakaway realm of the West, Gaul, Britain, Spain, ran itself under emperors of its own, with its own mint and consuls, not in rebellion against the idea of Rome, but in despair of the center's protection. And in the east, more remarkably still, the desert merchant city of Palmyra, grown rich for centuries brokering the silk and spice roads at the empire's edge, stepped into the wreckage of the Persian disasters, first as Rome's sword, then as its replacement. And its ruler, when this series pauses on her, was a woman, Zenobia, warrior queen of Palmyra, claiming descent from Cleopatra herself, learned, ambitious, and for a handful of years, sovereign in all but name over Syria, Arabia, and Egypt itself, her son styled emperor, her armies holding Rome's richest provinces and Rome's grain. She belongs, like the other women of this series, mostly to her own fuller telling elsewhere. But let her stand here at her real size for a moment. The Queen of the East, risen exactly in the crack the crisis opened. Because her career measures better than any battle how far, by the storm's darkest decade, the unthinkable had become the actual. The empire in three pieces, west, center, and east, and the center the weakest of the three. And one more thing grew in the storm, grew because of the storm, and it enters the ledger here quietly, because its seedbed was exactly this half-century of fear. The sect we last saw in Nero's gardens, a persecuted handful 2 long centuries back, had not vanished. It had traveled, along the very roads and sea lanes of our systems chapter, city to city, household to household, until by the crisis decades there were Christian communities in every province, still a small minority of the empire, but organized now, networked, led by bishops who corresponded across the whole Roman world, and growing fastest precisely where the age hurt most. The historians of the Church and the evidence of the pagans agree, broadly, on why. In the plague years, when the sick were abandoned in the streets by their own kin, the Christians, holding in Christian belief that death was a door and the sufferer was their brother, conspicuously stayed and nursed and buried their own and not only their own. A bishop's surviving letters from a stricken city describe his congregation dying of exactly this mercy, and even hostile observers noticed the pattern. In a broken age, the sect offered what the age was running out of: community, certainty, care, and a story in which the storm itself had meaning. But the age's fear noticed them too, for in Roman belief, remember, calamity on this scale could only mean the Pax Deorum was broken, heaven's peace forfeited by someone, and who more plainly than the people who refused on principle to give the gods their due. So it was in these very decades that the empire, for the first time, moved against them systematically. Imperial edicts requiring every inhabitant to sacrifice to the gods for the state's safety and carry a certificate of compliance. Loyalty made a ritual, the Pax Deorum by paperwork, and those who refused faced prison, confiscation, and death. Many complied, or bought certificates, and the Church would argue for generations over how to receive them back. Many others did not, and their names went into the calendar of martyrs that the Christians kept as carefully as Rome kept its consuls. A parallel state of memory, growing inside the empire's own. 2 theologies, 2 liturgies, 2 calendars now inhabited the one storm-battered world, each explaining the storm by the other's offense, and the old rites, be it said plainly, still filled the temples of every town, still opened every assembly, still owned, as far as any Roman in power could see, the future. Hold the whole picture, framed evenly, as this series promised from the start it would be. It is about to matter enormously, that it did not end there, that this chapter is not the last in the series, is owed to the storm's own strange gift. The crisis, which killed emperors by the dozen, also forged them. The men thrown up by the army in the storm's second half were of a new breed. Balkan frontier soldiers, almost to a man, born in the empire's hardest frontier provinces to families of nothing, illiterate some of them, brilliant most of them, emperors of the parade ground who ruled from the saddle and rarely saw Rome at all, and the greatest of them, in 5 furious years, put the world back together. His name was Aurelian, a cavalry officer of legendary severity. His own troops' nickname for him translates roughly as sword in hand, who beat the northern invaders out of Italy, then rode east and broke Palmyra, taking its queen alive, Her end is disputed. The kindest and best attested version has her paraded in his triumph and then pensioned to a villa near Rome, a Roman matron's retirement at the end of as improbable a career as the age had seen. Then wheeled west and reabsorbed the breakaway Gallic realm almost without a battle, its last emperor negotiating his own surrender. The coins hailed Aurelian, with for once no exaggeration, as restorer of the world. He gave the reunited empire a reformed coinage, a purge of corrupt mint masters. They rose in an actual pitched battle inside Rome, a measure of how deep the rot ran, and, in Roman belief's own register, a new patron for the recovered unity, a great temple to the unconquered sun, a single supreme radiance above all the old gods, whose festival later ages would associate with the last week of December, a monotheising drift in the old religion itself, the empire's crisis reaching even into heaven and consolidating there too. Remember it when, in the chapters just ahead, another faith of one God comes to the throne. And then, at the height of it all, riding east for Persia, Aurelian was murdered by a clerk's forged death list and a panicked knot of officers. For nothing, the sources agree, but a secretary's fear of punishment. The restorer of the world, 5 years given, and the storm machinery of assassination simply took him like the rest. The age could produce saviors. It could not yet protect them from itself. But he left the age its monument, and the monument is where this chapter has been heading all along. Because nothing says what the 3rd century did to Rome more plainly than the thing Aurelian built at home. For 600 years, since the raiders from the north whom this series met in a single humbled phrase back in part 1, the city of Rome had had no working walls. She had outgrown the old ones centuries before, and never troubled to replace them. Her wall, Romans like to say, was the legions, was the frontier itself, 1,000 miles away. Aurelian, who knew better now, ringed the capital of the world with 12 miles of brick-faced rampart, roughly 20 feet high and studded with towers, thrown up at speed, cutting through gardens and tombs, mausoleums and aqueduct arches swallowed whole into its fabric where they stood in the way. The walls still stand tonight, in long rose-colored stretches, among the most complete ancient fortifications anywhere on earth, and every Roman who watched them rise understood exactly what they said, and said it, no doubt, quietly or not at all. The ring is no longer trusted to hold. The center now armors itself. Something has ended that no one has announced. Let us end the chapter there, on the new wall, at night, keeping our custom of leaving the great story for the small one. We may picture a sentry on Aurelian's wall in the years just after the builder's murder, a young auxiliary, Pannonian-born, on the middle watch of a winter night, pacing his stretch of rampart between 2 towers on the city's southern arc. Below him on one side, Rome, the breathing dark of near 1 million people, banked and enormous, pricked with cressets, the smell of smoke and river fog, somewhere a dog, somewhere a night cart on stone. The Colosseum's black ring guessed at against the sky glow. Below him on the other side, the Campagna, the open dark of the old countryside, tomb-lined roads running out into it, a farm dog answering the city one. And beyond that, nothing his eye can find, which is precisely what he is here to watch. His brazier snaps in the cold. His breath fogs. The watchword tonight came down at dusk, as it has come down every dusk of this series since a fort on a northern river. The machine, whatever else has happened, still keeps its liturgy. And when the rounds officer passes, lantern and challenge and the word given back. The two of them stand a moment, as men on night duty will, looking out at the dark country instead of at each other. The sentry is 20. The wall under his boots is newer than he is. Everything he has ever heard of, the golden afternoon, the empire without walls, coins of true silver, emperors who died in bed, is his grandfather's talk, a world he politely does not quite believe in. This to him is normal. The wall, the watch, the word, the dark. And that, a generation for whom the emergency is simply the world, is the deepest thing the 3rd century did, deeper than any sacked city. It reset what Romans expected of life. When the storm finally passed, no one would try to rebuild the golden afternoon. They would build for the world the century knew. For the storm was, at last, passing. In the years after Aurelian, the emergency's own graduates, those hard Balkan professionals, succeeded one another through the usual murders. But the frontiers now mostly held, and the machinery, patched and armored, ran on. The roads repaired, the grain moving, the eagles back on the rivers facing outward. What was still missing was the thing whose absence had opened every wound of the past 50 years. A design, some way of holding, sharing, and passing on supreme power that did not run through a camp acclamation and a knife. The empire had been saved by improvisation. It could not live by it. And in the imperial guard of those years, there was rising, watchfully, one more Balkan soldier, a freedman's son from the Dalmatian coast, cautious where Aurelian had been headlong, an organizer where his predecessors had been swordsmen, a man who had survived the whole meat grinder of the age by missing nothing and hurrying nothing. When his moment came, and the armies raised him in his turn, he would give the wounded empire what no one had thought to give it in 300 years. A complete redesign. New government, new court, new provinces, new taxes, new capitals, everything remade at last, to fit the world as it actually now was. His name was Diocletian. With him, the long emergency ends, the long dusk begins, and so does part 3 of our story. Here part 2 closes then, where it opened, with the mask of Augustus, carried out of a burning republic by a frail boy, worn through golden decades and monstrous ones, auctioned, fought over, and dropped in the mud of 50 years' emergency. About to be picked up one more time, by a man who will decide the mask itself must be entirely remade. Rest now. The empire has survived its longest storm, and it will keep till you return. Changed, as all things in this story change, except the river.